Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, January 13th. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's Deputy Political Editor. On the show, Keir Starmer called on Boris Johnson to resign yesterday. Should he? I'll speak to Rod Liddle and James Forsyth. The Prime Minister says he won't be doing anything until Sue Gray, the civil servant looking into the Number 10 parties, releases her findings. Jill Rutter, herself a former civil servant, will join me to discuss what she might say. Meanwhile, as 100,000 Russian troops are stationed at the Ukrainian border, delegations from Moscow and Washington are meeting in Vienna for crisis talks. What is Putin going to do? Owen Matthews and Dmitri Alperovitch will be on the show. Finally, in a piece for the Spectator's World Edition, Mary Harrington says COVID has exacerbated class divides and created a new laptop class. She'll be on to explain. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode ever again. And why not subscribe to the Spectator magazine too? You can get 12 weeks in the magazine in print and online along with a free £20 Amazon voucher for just £12. Just go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Boris Johnson has admitted that he was at a party in the Number 10 garden in May 2020, even if he claims he thought it was a work event. At PMQs yesterday, Keir Starmer called on the Prime Minister to resign, saying he was a pathetic spectacle of a man. Rod Liddle, in his column for the magazine, agrees and writes that the sooner Johnson is gone, the better. James Forsyth, meanwhile, in his cover piece, asks whether this might be one mistake too far. Are we really seeing the end of Boris Johnson? Rod and James join me now. Rod, in this week's magazine, you find common cause with the likes of Keir Starmer, Douglas Ross, the Scottish Conservatives leader, in saying that ultimately the sooner Boris Johnson goes, the better. What's brought you to this conclusion?
Well, what's brought me to this conclusion is the rather pompous phrase that he's lost all moral authority. You could argue that he'd lost all moral authority every previous time he's lied, but in this one where it's so patently clear and to such fury from the public, then I think it's all gone. But I mean, the real reason he has to go is because he's of no use anymore. In that Boris's deal with the Conservative Party is, I will be incompetent and Boris-like, but I will win you elections. But that doesn't look very likely at the moment. He's miles behind in the polls. I think the lowest the Tories have been in 10 years. Behind Labour. So that thing which Boris once had, which is that he could win the elections, no longer looks as if it's true. The counter-argument, I suppose, and what some of the Conservatives will cling to, is that whilst Boris is incompetent and lies reflexively at seemingly every juncture, he gets the big things right, such as Brexit, such as winning in 2019, and crucially, and we ought to give him credit for this, telling Sage to get stuffed 3 weeks ago. All of those were good decisions, which I suspect the public rather likes him for. But it's become outweighed, and I just think his position is pretty much untenable.
And James, that argument which Rod just summarised is one that Michael Gove made to Tory MPs this week at a meeting of the 1922 committee. He was there to talk about cladding and levelling up, but gave a speech saying on the big calls, the Prime Minister is still right and that's why he should have their backing. Do you think that the Prime Minister does have the backing of the majority of the Parliamentary Party right now?
I think the majority of the Parliamentary Party right now don't want the blood and drama of a leadership contest. But I think they are sitting and waiting to see how the public react. Rod's right. The Tory party's relationship with Boris Johnson has always been very transactional. I don't think the Tory party would have made Boris Johnson leader except in the circumstances they were in, where they had just come, I think, fifth in the European elections. They were polling very badly. They looked to be set for a kind of complete electoral wipeout. And as one someone who's known Boris Johnson for as long as Rod once put it to me, the Tory party were only ever going to turn to him when they were kind of 2-0 down with 15 minutes to go, and he was their super sub in those circumstances. He came on, he won them a majority of a size that I don't think any other Tory could have done. I think the danger for him now is, if a sense goes that he's moved from electoral asset to liability, then I think you will see the ruthless side of the Tory party.
Rod, Boris Johnson did offer an apology, or at least a part apology, at Prime Minister's questions this week, saying he could understand why people were upset, even if perhaps technically, he still believes he was within the rules. Did that sway you at all, his apology?
Yes, it swayed me in the other direction, that he should go even quicker. I mean, it wasn't an apology. It was a Weasley little Tony Blair kind of non-apology apology. In that he apologised if people were upset, so nothing to do with him. He apologised that the party could have been better arranged, maybe they should have had it inside, whilst always stating that he hadn't broken any rules. It was a non-apology, and I thought for the first 3 or 4 questions at question time, Keir Starmer got it absolutely right and was rather good. And I suppose that the problem will come for Boris when we find out the results of this investigation. I think the thing which may hasten the Conservative Party view, and James will put me right on this, is if it is found that Boris was technically not breaking the law because, of course, Downing Street is Crown property, but if that is the only reason that the law wasn't broken, then I think that is a technicality which the public simply will not swallow, and I suspect Tory MPs won't swallow it either.
James, do you agree with that? Do you think the report will be a pivotal moment? I mean, it does feel as though for ministers and the Prime Minister right now, the report's almost useful, because they can just stonewall any questions by saying, just wait a few weeks.
I think the report will be quite factual, and I think one of the reasons why some of those around Boris Johnson are so keen to kind of emphasise the importance of the report is it's not the report's job to write a sentence like the Prime Minister should resign, and I think that they will hope to point to the fact that the report doesn't say that and say, oh well, he's been cleared, time to move on. I think the difference between this report and civil servants are understandably reluctant to look like they are forcing a Prime Minister out. If you think of Robin Butler's report into the intelligence around Iraq's weapons of mass destruction and how that was used to make the case for war in 2004, or even Lord Geit's letter to Boris Johnson about whether he broke the ministerial code over the arrangements for redecorating his flat. They don't want to be the person who looks like they have forced out a Prime Minister, because they are an unelected official, not an elected politician. But I think the difference between this story and those stories is this is a very simple story for the public to understand. This isn't about whether intelligence should be triple sourced as opposed to single sourced, the difference between human intelligence and signals intelligence. It's something much more simple and something that people feel far more viscerally. And I think this is one of the things that Tory MPs are saying is, that those rules in the first lockdown were so strict that people are kind of really furious at the idea that that people in government who were making those rules were finding ways to stay within the rules but do things that other people weren't doing. And I think that is where it is so dangerous for Boris Johnson.
Rod, one of the things that appears to be keeping Boris Johnson safe or safer is ultimately the fact there is no consensus right now on who should replace him. And therefore, you wouldn't really have a neat successor brought in. You could have actually quite a messy contest. Is there anyone who has caught your eye as someone who would do a better job?
Yes, William Clouston, the leader of the Social Democratic Party, but him aside, and he's probably not in the running, Katy, at this point. Obviously, I spoke to a Conservative MP this morning who told me that there were 250 of his colleagues who wanted Boris out. I mean, he said 250. And I think that some of the press and some of the commentators have got it into their heads that there will be a kind of genial coronation of Rishi Sunak. But there's quite a lot of people within the Conservative Party who do not want Rishi Sunak, largely because of his fiscal policies. And there are even more people in that party who don't want Liz Truss for various reasons. So I think you probably, I know James will put me right, and I'm sure knows this far better than I do, but my guess is that when a leadership election does come along, and my guess is that it will come along sometime within the next 4 to 6 months, that when it does come along, there'll be 6 or 7 people on there. And the great lesson of Conservative Party leadership campaigns is that the favourite never wins.
James, do you think that they'll be able to fit all the candidates in a potential Tory leadership contest in one room?
I think there'll be no shortage of candidates. I think, again, as happened last time, there will have to be some kind of winnowing process. The rules don't formally require people to have a certain amount of support, but I think that is what is going to have to happen, because when you are in government, you cannot have a contest with 15 candidates at the start of it. I think there will undoubtedly be a contest. I think that I think there's an odd jockeying. No one wants to be the front runner in Tory leadership contests for the reasons that Rod says, and I think so much of these Tory leadership contests depends on the timing, the precise way in which this thing starts. I think one of the things that I will say is that when parties pick successors, they always tend to go for someone who is the opposite of what went before. So the Tory party went from, if you go through it, from Margaret Thatcher's domineeringness to kind of John Major with his desire to just kind of, Whip's desire to kind of keep the party together. They went from the smoothness of David Cameron to Theresa May's very different persona. They went from Theresa May to Boris Johnson. So I think the person who succeeds Boris Johnson, if there is a leadership contest, will be someone who feels very different to him in terms of political style and approach.
Well, indeed, good point, James. So in other words, they're probably going to choose someone competent and honest.
Rod, can you think of anyone who would fall into that category?
But can I think of anyone? Well, you see, I always go with the crowd as a social conservative. Therefore, I quite like Liz Truss at the moment. Whether she, and people think that John Major, for example, was not a born leader, a born prime minister, but. And in fact, in my opinion, he turned out not to be a terribly good prime minister or leader. But we don't think of people inhabiting that role until they actually inhabit it. And so, frankly, it could be pretty much anyone. I don't know the runners and riders. I just hope it's someone who is a social conservative and who can row back a bit against in the culture war, which I think is one of the reasons, an important reason, why those red wall seats went to the Conservatives last time around. It was far less the attraction of Boris and far more a thoroughgoing dislike of the anti-patriotism and wokeness of Corbyn.
Now, James, we're talking about what a potential Tory leadership contest this year would look like, but perhaps you could help us envisage the other scenario, which is still possible. Boris Johnson has bounced back before. What do you think the scenario is where Boris Johnson actually does get through this, and what does he then need to do to secure his position, if he can do anything?
I think the scenario in which he gets through this is the Gray report is quite factual. It doesn't contain direct criticism of him. But there are various senior heads in Downing Street role on both the political and the civil service side, allowing him to say that he's cleaned house. Tory MPs decide to stay their hand, say, look, let's wait until we see what the results of these May local elections are. And then kind of gradually other political issues come to the fore, cost of living, energy crisis. Then you have the May elections. They're bad, but they're not catastrophic. He says, look, this is kind of classic midterm problems for the government, and we're coming out with measures soon to help people with the cost of living. And, it goes on. And it's worth remembering that, that always one of the reasons why party leaders and particularly prime ministers survive is that their MPs want to wait for the kind of perfect moment to change leader or the perfect moment to trigger a contest. And there is never such a thing in politics. And that, I think, is the way that Boris Johnson comes back. And then he starts to say, look, we got out of COVID restrictions before other places because of the decisions that I took, and he can rebuild that way. But I think one of the things that will be difficult for him is that even before this story broke, this year didn't look like it was going to have much political good news for him in it, given the squeeze on cost of living from inflation, rising energy bills, and all of those things. And I also think he's at that difficult phase of his premiership where there is, at the beginning of your premiership, big statements. So if he came out and said, we're going to turn around every boat in the channel, that rallies support to you. Once you have been in office for as long as he has now, when you say things, people are waiting to see whether they actually happen rather than just giving you applause for what you say.
And finally, Rod, is there anything Boris Johnson could say that would make you change your mind, then make you think that actually he is the right person to lead the party?
No, I don't think so. But I think James is right, and I think that's not an unlikely scenario that he does continue to battle onward. I mean, I think the May elections are important. If they reflect what the polls are saying now, which is that 36% of people who voted Conservative in red wall seats will now no longer do so, then that puts a whole raft of seats up for grabs, especially where I am at the moment in Teesside. Virtually the whole of Teesside went Conservative, apart from Middlesbrough Central. Once that happens, then you do have a whole bunch of very, very nervous MPs who will be agitating for change, as well as those in the party, excuse me, who were never terribly happy with Boris in the first case. And actually, if you think about it, June, July for a leadership contest, it's actually not a bad time for the Conservatives to do that. Exactly midterm, but you get a new leader in, honeymoon period, things look good for a bit, you hold another election and probably win it. That's the other scenario. But I think James's notion that he may well get away with it and just bluster on through is quite possible.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, James. So the Prime Minister urged MPs to wait until Sue Gray, the civil servant looking into number 10 parties, finishes her inquiry. So who is Gray and what might she say about the Prime Minister? I'm joined now by Jill Rutter, a former civil servant who is now a senior fellow at the Institute of Government. Jill, this week it's not just Boris Johnson who we keep hearing about, it's also someone called Sue Gray. When a politician doesn't want to answer a question about various parties, the frequent reply is, let's wait till Sue Gray has finished investigating. Now, Sue Gray is a civil servant. Can you tell us a bit about her?
So Sue Gray is quite an interesting person. She's a very senior civil servant. She's her day job is as a second permanent secretary, shared between the Cabinet Office and Michael Gove's Levelling Up department, because she's in charge of relations with the devolved government. She actually, at the sort of times of the lockdown, it's quite interesting that she's only just recently come back to the Cabinet Office from Northern Ireland, where she went off to be permanent secretary at the Department of Finance. Put her hat in the ring to be head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, which is a separate civil service, but didn't get that job and so came back to London. But where she really, came to a degree of public attention, though obviously nothing like now, is as Director General of Propriety and Ethics in the Cabinet Office, where for the Cabinet Secretary and successive Prime Ministers, she would investigate dubious behaviour by a variety of ministers. So, for example, it was Sue Gray that put the kibosh on Damien Green's career over the investigation into him. So that's Sue Gray's track record. So she's been there, done that in terms of investigations before. What she's never really had to do before is do something where the buck might very well end up with the Prime Minister. So that's the distinct awkwardness of this particular investigation. And of course, she's only doing it now because it was originally tasked to the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, but then 10 days later he had to recuse himself when it was revealed that he might have been at a party in the Cabinet Office.
And as you say, Jill, it's a very unusual situation to have a civil servant ultimately in charge of a report that could really severely impact the Prime Minister's position. And therefore, there does seem to be some confusion over how bad this report could really be for Boris Johnson. Because ministers have ultimately all said, oh, we'll wait till this report. Boris Johnson has also said, wait till this report before you get there. I think some think it could say something along the lines of, Boris Johnson broke the law, he must go. But that's not quite what we're talking about, is it? What is it more realistically going to say in terms of the various scenarios?
So the thing she was asked to investigate was whether there were parties, because remember, this investigation was set up when that video that the Prime Minister told the Commons he was shocked by, the Allegra Stratton video, came out, and the Prime Minister had still been telling Parliament that there were no parties, that guidance was followed at all times. So Sue Gray's really trying to establish the facts about were there parties. The interesting thing is, how much further does she go than that? Does she tell us, she'd probably say some things about the culture in Number 10 and the way they treated that. Does she go into why did they think they were compatible with the prevailing guidance and rules at the time? We know the guidance and rules are a bit different sometimes. So why do they think this was okay? Does she tell us anything about who were the movers and shakers behind having these parties? Does she tell us anything about what the Prime Minister knew or didn't know? Don't know how narrowly or widely she'll interpret her remit. I think she's in a really, really difficult position. What Sue Gray won't do, though, is say the Prime Minister must go. That really, she will pass the ball over to two different sort of sets of people. One for the sort of fallout for any civil servants implicated and criticised in her report. If she does that, then any disciplinary action doesn't fall to Sue Gray, it falls to Simon Case as the head of the civil service. Any fallout for the Prime Minister, she can't do that. She's not going to say Boris Johnson's got to go. Basically, she'll hand the report to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister could decide to refer himself to Lord Geit or to the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, possibly, who can make judgments on whether he breached the ministerial code. But really, 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 the important action then turns to the Prime Minister's backbench colleagues and his ministers in his cabinet. Do they think that based on whatever facts Sue Gray chooses to expose and what evidence she uncovers, that the Prime Minister can't go on? And that's really for them to determine. So, yeah, the problem for Sue Gray is that she's really on a bit of a hiding to nothing. I think the civil service should never have accepted that it would investigate this, because at the moment she's a convenient delaying tactic. But the trouble is that her report risks satisfying absolutely nobody. There will be people who say the civil service is trying to get at the Prime Minister. We've had quite a tricky period for relations between ministers and the civil service. And if it increases the pressure on the Prime Minister, people will say, well, we always knew the civil service didn't like this government very much. If, however, it gives meat to those who want to exonerate the Prime Minister, then she'll be accused of doing a whitewash for her political masters. So I think it's in a really, really difficult position. Just shows why actually you should never ask a civil servant to investigate the Prime Minister.
And as you touched on, I mean, we've already seen Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House, talk about how if there, is HR in a report, ultimately it's civil servants who should lose their jobs rather than politicians. That would not be the right way about going about things. Before I suppose we get on to potentially civil servants who could be vulnerable, I just wondered, one of the things that Sue Gray's report could do is bring more evidence to light, put it in the public realm. And what access does she get? Will she be able to look at things like CCTV? We know when it comes to, for example, that email which was leaked from Martin Reynolds inviting staff to a drinks party, that would be something she has hold of. But what kind of teeth does she have when it comes to getting information?
So the interesting thing is that the team is basically her old team, including a guy called Darren Tierney, who's doing her old job as Director General of Propriety and Ethics. So what just changed was who was at the top of the investigation. But these aren't like super sleuths. I mean, yes, they will be asking people, interviewing people, asking them what went on, interviewing a lot of people in Number 10, I imagine. They may have asked for access that anyone has to memos, whether people disclose them or whether we find that the people outside government actually have better access than Sue Gray. I mean, it would be really interesting to know whether she knew about the 20th of May party in its full glory before it, Dominic Cummings sort of put it into the public domain and that memo was leaked to Paul Brand at ITV. We don't know that. I think one of the real risks for Sue Gray is that people think that she's been a bit over hasty and not got the full information out. But, this isn't a sort of police investigation. It's a disciplinary, if you like, investigation to see whether about behaviour internally. So it's more an HR style investigation. So she'll depend it on, people wanting to cooperate with their bosses. But the clear message from Simon Case, a civil servant, should be that you have to engage with Sue Gray and let her have all the information that you have. Downing Street, as you say, does have sort of security videos. We saw that in the famous Plebgate investigation into Andrew Mitchell, that those security cameras there. But is it that obvious? I mean, the people working in number 10, she might be able to say when, for example, at the famous 18th December party, the first party, were there lots of outsiders that booked into number 10? When you go into number 10, as you know, Katie, you have to sort of sign in, show your pass, be on a list. She might want to look at that. But if it's just staff in number 10, do we know that, are there photographs of people going in, handing big crates of booze or whatever? Or did they just have a sort of, few cans in their backpack? Bit difficult to tell. And I know when I went to number 10, I was always a bit embarrassed about being caught on camera going into number 10 with that week's stash of Diet Cokes to get me through the week. So, I mean, people do work there as well as party there. So it's quite difficult in that sense to do that. So does she interview Dorman? I don't know. I mean, it's up for her to decide how to do it and to balance, I think, almost the need for speed against the need for this to be clearly a sort of, thorough job. And Sue Gray will also have an eye on her own personal reputation. I mean, she'll want to have been seen to have done a good, thorough, professional and fair job, because ultimately a lot of people's, future careers could be blighted by what she says. So she has to be quite careful that she is genuinely fair to those.
Yeah. And just finally, we talked about how ultimately ousting a prime minister is always going to be a political decision, but there are some other figures, Martin Reynolds, the senior advisor to Boris Johnson, civil service, who ultimately sent that email. So do you think we could start to see civil servants referred for disciplinary, or that could be perhaps the sculpts of this report?
Well, that will ultimately be a decision for Simon Case, assuming, of course, that Simon Case himself doesn't come in for criticism in the report, which is also possible. I think, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays. If there's absolutely sort of unequivocal evidence that civil servants in number 10 basically indulge in sort of serial rule breaking, then I think it'd be very difficult for them to stay there. And indeed, those are the very people who should have been advising the Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister had come down and said, oh, it's a nice day, we should thank staff at a work event outside, and the civil servants hadn't sort of advised, well, Prime Minister, we think that, would look very incompatible with the guidance that Oliver Dowden's just about to tell the nation about at the Downing Street press conference. I mean, you would possibly just criticise civil servants, even if their involvement was only that. If they were the movers and shakers behind this, then that's a different thing. And I think one of the tests for the civil service is how does it handle that? If something looks to the public like sort of really egregious behaviour, but the civil service's response is to try and brush it under a carpet and just perhaps slightly sooner than might otherwise have happened, move that person into the job they would have got anyway, then I think the civil service will probably be criticised for not taking this seriously enough. So I think there's going to be quite a tricky question. The other big question, I think, for number 10, and I don't know whether Sue Gray will see that this is within her remit at all or not, is On what basis did the Prime Minister give all those assurances that the guidelines were followed at all times? Because that really is one of the big issues for the Prime Minister, notwithstanding whether he went to that particular party or not. There's also a big issue about whether he, misled Parliament. You can say certainly looked a bit economical with what he admitted to knowing about, given what has happened in Number 10. And I don't know whether Sue Gray is going to go into how Number 10 handled the questioning about this, because clearly they weren't at all forthcoming until that initial video leak forced their hand.
Thank you, Jill. Away from Westminster, Russian and American delegations are meeting in Vienna this week, with the two countries looking to negotiate a solution to the crisis in Ukraine. 100,000 Russian troops are stationed on Ukraine's eastern border, readying, some experts say, for an invasion. In this week's magazine, Owen Matthews writes that Putin's actions are motivated by nightmares of revolution rather than dreams of empire. He joins me now alongside Dmitri Alperovitch, a security expert and founder of Silverado, a non-profit in Washington. Owen, in this week's magazine, you write that Putin is ultimately worried about a revolution. Can you go into some details?
Well, he's worried about revolution in general, because revolution is being one of the biggest spokes in the wheels of his foreign policy. Because unfortunately, for Putin, revolutions have toppled successive governments, most of them pro-Russian, in a swathe of post-Soviet countries. And my argument in this week's magazine is that the unrest last week in Kazakhstan is very worrying for Putin, because unlike, for instance, in Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, that have all experienced the so-called colored people power revolutions over the last couple of decades, those are all kind of more or less chaotic democracies. Kazakhstan is not a chaotic democracy. It's actually very similar to Russia in its political and economic structure. It's run by a small clique of bureaucrat oligarchs. It's been systematically repressing its domestic opposition. It operates a Russian-style type of managed democracy, as they call it, except that the management kind of came unstuck for reasons that Western observers so far are not very clear about. But clearly there was an extraordinary convulsion of violence coming apparently from nowhere that certainly rocked the regime. We're not sure how close it came to toppling the regime, but certainly it came close enough for the president Akayev to actually call in reinforcements from Russia and other former Soviet states. So my argument is that that's worrying for Putin, because if it can happen in Kazakhstan, perhaps it can happen in Russia.
Dmitri, do you agree with that? Do you think, in a way, perhaps there's a misreading sometimes when we read, Putin is longing for an empire, and actually this is more of a defensive action?
So I do think that Putin wants to recreate Russia's sphere of influence. I don't necessarily think he wants to recreate the Soviet Union as it existed back then. He frankly doesn't want to own all these states that are, in many cases, economic basket cases, and endure Russia with the need to support them. In fact, there was quite a bit of resentment in the later stages of the Soviet Union amongst Russians that they were sending all this money to support all the other Soviet republics, and very little of it was coming back to help Russia itself. So I don't think he wants to do that, but he clearly wants to make sure that Russia has a strong say in foreign policy and to some extent even domestic affairs of these countries, particularly when it comes to energy policy that is of national security to the Russian Federation. On Kazakhstan, I have to disagree a little bit with Owen, because I think that the situation is quite a bit more complicated. Certainly you had the protests that started on January 2nd that were driven by economic demands for change and corruption, and seem to have been just spontaneous popular protests. But very quickly they turned violent with some very shady characters showing up in those protests, taking over security buildings, setting them on fire, taking arms, shooting at security officers fairly accurately. And there's still a debate going on who exactly those people were, what their agenda was. One of the common theories is that these were people that were actually allied with certain security forces that were loyal to Nazarbayev, the previous president, who nominated his successor, the current president Tokayev. But there's been a lot of friction between the two parties, between the Tokayev party, who still had not had full control of the armed forces and security forces, even though he was president. And there was concern on the part of the Nazarbayev faction that once Nazarbayev dies, he's in his 80s and has a number of medical ailments, that their power would be lost. So it appears that there may have been a coup attempt. It appears that may have been a coup attempt that was trying to leverage the popular protests. And frankly, the way it turned out is an unbelievable success for Putin, because what ended up happening is that Putin, with very little cost and commitment, sending just about 2,500 troops into Kazakhstan, and now appearing to pull them out, so just about a week-long deployment, has managed to, one, prop up Tokayev and secure his hold on power, and at the same time pull him squarely into Russia's orbit, where Tokayev now owes Putin. In fact, he's said that publicly, and Putin has much better influence and control over Kazakhstan's foreign policy than he ever did. Previously, under the Nazarbayev regime, they were focused on what they called multi-vectoring, trying to accommodate the interests of Russia, China, and the West. Now it's going to be squarely single-vectoring, much of it towards Russia.
And Owen, what about the situation in Ukraine? Because we've spoken previously about this, and there is lots of speculation that Russia can move in come January. US and Russia are holding talks this week. Are we seeing a sign of Putin ramping up, or not so much?
Well, I think just to pick up on a very important thing that Dmitri just said is Dmitri believes, and I also believe, that Putin wants to restore his sphere of influence, but does not want to restore the empire. Now, that's actually an enormous difference. It's really very crucial in understanding this. And this is a situation that could very easily spiral out of control. But I firmly believe that the evidence points to the military buildup as a kind of heavy metal diplomacy and not the prelude to a serious invasion. And the reason I believe that is threefold. One is that actually there are very few scenarios by which actually Putin can actually achieve something useful to him with a ground invasion, particularly not where in the part of Ukraine where the troops are massing, which is in fact on the Ukraine Belarusian Russian border, which is actually just north of Kiev. It's nowhere, it's actually not on the disputed, or rather on the separatist territories of Donetsk and Lugansk. I mean, clearly Putin is actually trying to, in my opinion, make a point and actually force NATO to come to some decision, and that's about its engagement with Ukraine. And I think that's the beginning and the end of Putin's strategic ambitions there. I mean, he's very forcibly not absorbed the breakaway republics of Eastern Ukraine. I mean, if he wanted more territory, if he wanted more empire, he could have done that. He hasn't done that. He's left them inside Ukraine to be a sort of pain in the side of the Ukrainian government, basically forever. I mean, Putin's agenda is different. To Putin, NATO expansion is not the solution to the problem, it's the cause of this problem. It's a dialogue of the deaf. Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, all these countries that have had very understandable historical traumas with the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire are all saying, he wants to invade Ukraine, we need to accept Ukraine into NATO. But I believe that actually that's the opposite of the truth, is that in fact, it's the engagement of Ukraine, of NATO with Ukraine, and particularly the deployment of military advisors and lethal technologies in military, US military aid and so on. That's actually the problem. And Putin is actually just trying to do essentially what John F. Kennedy did in 1961 and 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and just say, you cannot come to our doorstep, our backyard with your missiles. Ukraine is the step too far. That is an absolute threat to our Russian, to our essential national security interests, and you're not going to do that. that. That's his point. I don't think his agenda is to actually invade Ukraine at all. There's no way he can win. He may be deluded, but he's not. He may be misinformed, but I don't think Putin is actually suicidal.
And Dmitri, just finally, I wondered, what do you think is the biggest threat to Putin? Do you think, as we discussed and it's discussed in the article, it is, people power, or is it some of the other things we're talking about?
Well, I think that there are a number of things that Putin cares about. Certainly, he wants stability. He wants what he calls managed democracy, which is turning more and more into outright autocracy within Russia. So he wants no challenge to his regime. He wants to ultimately figure out a way to retire with a successor that is going to take care of his interests most likely. And the one problem with the Kazakhstan scenario is that he has seen the Nazarbayev scenario that he was probably eyeing with some envy when Nazarbayev retired but still held on to power, disintegrate before his eyes in last week. So he's probably thinking now that he'll have to die in office and not trust his successor to keep him safe. But when it comes to the near abroad, I think his interests are to sort of make Russia great again, if you will, and make sure that Russia has tremendous sphere of influence in the region. And that, when it comes to Ukraine in particular, I think his interests are twofold. One, he absolutely does not want NATO advisors, NATO weaponry in Ukraine. I think Owen is absolutely right about that. But he also doesn't want Ukraine in NATO. I think both are red lines for Russia. And he's trying to achieve that objective right now with a threat of invasion. I still think, unlike Owen, that invasion is likely because he's not going to get anywhere on the diplomatic front. And in fact, they're cornering themselves with the rhetoric, particularly with the rhetoric that Rabkov was talking about, the deputy foreign minister in Geneva, who was negotiating with Wendy Sherman, saying that they want ironclad, bulletproof, waterproof guarantees, legally binding guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, which of course the U.S. and NATO allies have rejected just out of hand. So when you come in with that strong position and say that this is your top priority and you will take nothing less, it makes it very difficult to see how they achieve any sort of diplomatic victory and save face domestically or internationally. And I'm very afraid that they may indeed invade. Now, I agree with Owen. They have, I think, no interest in annexing Ukraine or any part of Ukraine. I think they want to create sort of a puppet state, just like they have in Lugansk and Donetsk. And I don't think they'll take over all of Ukraine. I don't think they'll even try to take Kiev. But I think they can grab a big chunk of the eastern Ukraine territory up to the Dnieper River, potentially.
Thank you, Dmitri. Thank you, Owen. In the January edition of Spectator World, Mary Harrington says the pandemic has not just revealed but widened class divides. The upper classes can jet off, like Kim Kardashian did, to their own private island and avoid it all, and the middle classes can work from their laptops at home or an Airbnb. The working classes, though, she writes, have been forced to keep on working in restaurants, bars and hotels. To discuss, Mary joins me now. Mary, for the Spectator's World January edition, you write a piece where you begin by talking about a wedding. What was the significance of this wedding?
It caused a significant stir across the United States just for its sheer extravagance. It was reported in the pages of Vogue. As far as I can make out, it went on for at least 3 days. Every single detail of it was wildly expensive and wildly curated. I mean, it was mesmerising. It had a sort of Marie Antoinette energy about it. You know, every dress cost thousands. Every detail of it was just sort of wildly kind of sybaritic to a degree which is unimaginable, I think, to most ordinary people, simply because that's just not the world we live in. You know, we might be able to choose whether to go to this restaurant or that restaurant, but the idea of, inviting 1,000 of your closest friends to a wedding party or however many it was, and then offering them IV drips to deal with the hangover at the after party picnic the following morning, it's just a bit beyond most people's normal frame of reference. It had a kind of end of civilization, kind of hyper wealthy decadence to it, which I think just struck a very strange note at the end of a pandemic when a lot of people have been going through some really quite grim times.
And this is a wedding involving Ivy Getty from the wealthy Getty family. But in your piece, you make the example that this is, a sign of how COVID has not just highlighted, but actually exacerbated class divisions in society. Can you talk us through almost the various parts of that? Because there's one, obviously, the upper classes, you could call them, but there's another group, which is perhaps one that probably more people watching this could, compare their lifestyles to rather than this wedding.
So I outlined the ways in which Ivy Getty's wedding and also the Met Gala, which was not long before that, exemplified a very stark division which has been more I think, revealed than anything else by the pandemic, which is to say asymmetric rules on masking. It's now routine for people who are serving others of higher status to remain masked, while people who command higher status, whether permanently or temporarily, are exempt from that for whatever reason. And one example I gave was Ivy Getty's wedding, where the wedding party and Nancy Pelosi, who officiated, swept into the town hall, at which point all the attendees, all the guests, ritually put their masks on. But the wedding party remained unmasked. The same was very visible at the Met Gala. Photographs show that the guests were unmasked, but all the serving people were masked uniformly. And that was even visible at the beginning of the pandemic when Kim Kardashian tweeted from the private island where she'd arranged a get-together with all of her extended family, and they were all pictured hugging and drinking and having a lovely time while all of us were locked down or, saying goodbye to our dying grandmas through the nursing home window. Meanwhile, there are serving staff in the background collecting empties with their masks on at Kim Kardashian's private island. So that's so much for the aristocracy, who are, as it were, permanently exempt from masking. And masking, I think, stands as a kind of symbol of status in this way. Whether or not you're entitled to in-person human interaction. The Zoom class, I've tried to show how, if you're a member of the Zoom class, which is to say people who do knowledge work, I'd class myself, I suppose, as a member of that class. I work remotely. I could take my laptop and in theory work from anywhere. That class is sometimes gets to enjoy the mask-free privileges of the sort of Kardashians of this world, and at other times don't, and are also characterised by being extraordinarily neurotic about infection control. And I cited as an example an article in The Atlantic which reported a man going to a different wedding in New Orleans, where he panicked all the way through about the terrible riskiness of interacting in a normal way, mask-free, despite the fact that everybody who attended the wedding parties was already vaccinated. And then, as far as I could make out, absolutely freaked out when he caught COVID as a consequence of that, and hired an apartment down the road from his family, where his children would come and visit him, sitting 6 feet or more away on the porch wearing an N95 mask, which suggests a fairly extreme degree of anxiety about contamination, which to my eyes shades over from being sort of strictly medical and rational into something more like a sort of fears for spiritual purity. And I would say this has become increasingly characteristic of the Zoom class. And further down the food chain, that just simply isn't practically possible, because these are the people who are serving, in all of these settings, the people who collect rubbish bins or do care work or whatever, have done their best to manage infection control. But if you work with people on a daily basis as your job and can't work remotely, it's just not possible to become that neurotic about in-person human contact. It just isn't, because you remain in contact with people just by virtue of the nature of your work. And I think and what I really wanted to draw out was the way the pandemic has both stratified those classes in a much more extreme way, because it's not only rendered the divisions more visible, but it's also increased the difficulty of navigating back and forth between these classes.
Yeah, and
it's widened divisions between the richest and the poorest. I believe Jeff Bezos, for example, has added something like a multiple to his total wealth, while plenty of other people just went under.
And I wondered, Mary, do you think historically this is surprising? I mean, ultimately, you, I suppose, might expect, right or wrong, I think when you say wrong, that the rich will be the people who manage to have the least harm done to them in a crisis often, will be the ones who have the options when it comes to whether it's a private island or, getting away from something, or just making your own surroundings much more pleasant.
I think that's absolutely true. You know, it's the famous, you know, the rich do what they want, or the rich do what they can, and the poor suffer what they must. I think is as the famous saying has it. And that's probably always been the case. But what I really wanted to draw out in this article was the way that there's a sort of tragedy at work in terms of how this has played out within the sort of middling sort, the middle class, which has been undergoing a process of hollowing out, which has been detectable not just in America but across the West for some years, really since the Thatcher years. Then the economic liberal, the liberalisation of finance and deindustrialisation and the migrant outsourcing of industry, all of which has begun a slow, methodical breaking down of middle class prosperity and to a significant extent working class prosperity as well across the West in a way which is now increasingly starting to reveal itself as a very much starker and more stratified class hierarchy, you know, across all of these geographies where moving back and forth across these class barriers is just considerably more difficult. And what I really wanted to draw out was the irony of where the resistance is coming from in the West to masking and pandemic control measures, because a lot of it is actually coming from a sort of a more old-fashioned conservative bourgeoisie, many of whom were also right behind the economic reforms which have ended up hollowing out a lot of the sort of middle class prosperity, which is now being replaced by this very much more sort of information-led Zoom class and much thinner middle class. Whereas increasingly on both sides, as Joel Kotkin points out also in the January issue, instead we're seeing something very much more like a new feudalism.
You mentioned the narrowing of the middle class. So if you have the Zoom class and you're talking about the laptop class, you can ultimately go where they want to do, or perhaps aspire to live the lifestyles you talk about of the upper classes, the Gettys. What's happening to those who no longer fit into that middle class? Where do they now fit? Is that working class or something else?
I mean, these things are obviously complex and vary a lot by geography, but I suppose you could characterize a lot of what's happening and a lot of what's happening in the culture war, particularly as a contest between, you know, this sort of emerging Zoom class, you know, the knowledge class with their portable-ish laptop work that can happen from anywhere, and a much more place-based bourgeoisie, you know, which might be characterized by, you know, small business owners, for example, or people whose prosperity is connected to a particular geography, such as, you know, some smallholders, landowners, small business owners, people who you might characterize, I suppose, as a sort of old-fashioned yeomanry, and that's the class which is shrinking. And that's the class that you find lined up behind figures such as Donald Trump, you know, with a certain amount of incoherence in their argument, and a certain number, you know, and that brings a number of contradictions to the fore. But I think what we're looking at is a genuine set of class grievances and a genuine sense of threat at a whole sort of economic order and way of life which is becoming increasingly unstable and is being contested by an emerging new variant of the middle class, which just doesn't have the same commitments to place and has a wholly different set of economic interests. And I think those tensions are really only just starting to play out.
And just finally, on this week's episode, we've been talking a lot about Boris Johnson, the trouble that the government is in, and it all plays into this narrative that we saw with Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle of one rule for them. And it's been a really corrosive political narrative in lots of countries. You've seen it in various governments. But I wonder, when we're going back to these mask rules and talking about the wedding, Kim Kardashian's holiday, are we just seeing a more sophisticated version of this? Because it's not so much a breach of the rules, it's almost a new set of rules, the rules almost designed to allow for this inequality.
I certainly don't think that's how ordinary people perceive it. I'm not. If I'm honest, I'm not. I mean, I couldn't really speculate, but my hunch is it's unlikely to be even how our political leaders see it. You know, it's. I suspect that some form of masking rituals and class stratifications will persist, but in terms of our immediate political situation, my gut feel is that actually what's going on is something more like they've decided. People have more or less consciously decided that the pandemic is over or it's nearly over, and they'd like to pin as much of the collective misery of the British public and everything we've all undergone over the last year and a half or 2 years onto Boris Johnson as possible, and to designate him, as it were, as a kind of sin eater, and just to blame as much of that on him as possible, and then load him up with the outrage that comes, attendant on the fact that he wasn't even really following the rules himself, and then defenestrate him so that somebody with relatively clean hands can be installed. Certainly, if I were a Tory politician, that's what I'd be doing if I wanted to have a fighting chance of winning the next election. So I don't really think there's anything sort of large scale going on about public manners. I suspect it's much more about just brute politics.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for joining us today. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.